Hello, my name is Gil Panalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar where every other Tuesday I invite fascinating people to share their stories, their knowledge, so that all of us can become better, passionate advocates on what? On creating cities that are more equitable, sustainable, and fun, so that everyone can live healthier and happier. Originally, I'm from Bogota, Colombia, but now I've been living in Toronto, Canada for the last 26 years, and I am the founder and chair of 880 Cities. I've been fortunate to have worked in over 350 cities, and this webinar is one of the ways that I find of giving back, always free and hopefully always interesting. Today, fascinating guest and topic: pedestrian safety crisis. It's a crisis all over, in small cities, in large cities, in wealthy countries, in poor countries. Angie Schmitt wrote a bestseller, and she has been doing research all over the place. And whatever she presents on the US, it can be applicable to many cities everywhere. Angie, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and about how to make safe streets everywhere, how to make pedestrian the top priority of cities, because every trip begins and ends walking.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. It's so nice to have you. Your book is amazing. You have had a huge impact all over the place. And of course, also today, I want to pay my respect to the veterans. It's Remembrance Day in the US and in Canada, and we need to make respect to all of them. And Angie, uh, pedestrian safety crisis, it should have ended many, many, many years ago because it seems like we know what needs to be done, but it's not getting done. So I'm so happy to have you as guest because, and this is a very international webinar, but this is also a very international problem in small cities, in large cities, in poor countries, in rich countries. So please tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about the pedestrian safety crisis everywhere.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you all today. I wrote this book called Right of Way that was published. It was actually published right at the start of the pandemic. And I've been traveling around speaking about it for about 6 years now. During that time, I was calling, sort of coined this term, the pedestrian safety crisis, to describe this phenomenon that was going on. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. And I understand that this is my book was focused quite a bit on the US. However, there is a chapter that sort of puts it in international context. And I'm going to try to do that a little bit with this presentation as well. I'm curious, I was looking, we have seen this big increase in pedestrian deaths in the US. I'm going to talk about that. I'm curious whether some other high income nations are starting to see the same trends. I'm curious to hear from some of the guests potentially. So just real quickly, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to go over. I talk about a little bit about the history, how we sort of got to this point, what I mean by the pedestrian safety crisis, who is getting killed because there's a strong demographic component. Where it's happening, there's a strong geographic component, and if we look at where it's happening, that really helps tell the story of what's going on.
And by the way,
And
Angie, we have the chat, we close it during the presentation, but it will be open immediately after because everybody's paying attention to what you are saying. However, people, participants, remember that the Q&A is open. And most of the dialogue that I will have with Angie in the second half is based on the questions that you are sending.
Great. Okay. So I just want to warn people that there's going to be a section about cars. I'm going to talk about cars a little bit, what's going on in the auto market, because that has a big impact. And then at the end, we'll get a little bit into solutions and a couple reasons for optimism, sort of cautious. Okay. So I like to just, like I said, a little bit of history. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I'm using examples. I'm sorry, these are a little grainy. These are historical photos from Cleveland, where I live. And this photo here on the left is sort of our main street in Cleveland. And you can see this picture was actually the one on the left is 1909. And you can see this is our main street again. You can see there are a few cars already on the scene in Cleveland. But in this era, the primary mode of transportation was streetcars. And you can see the thing I really want people to notice about this is just how many pedestrians there are. And another thing I want people to notice is just kind of how relaxed they look crossing the road. At this point in our history, there were no crosswalks. The whole idea of jaywalking had not been introduced. And so pedestrians had sort of free right to the roads. They would pause and greet each other. There was commerce that happened in the roads. Children would play in the roads. But that changed very quickly in a short period in the US and a number of other industrialized countries. But I think no other industrialized countries to the extent probably of the US. So there's another guy that wrote a book called Fighting Traffic that gets into the politics of this period. And he says, contrary to sort of popular belief, there was actually a lot of anger about this during this period. This period in the 20s, the 10s, when cars start flooding into cities, a lot of people started getting killed and injured, and disproportionately they were children. So a lot of people were kind of up in arms, and the impulse at the time was to blame drivers. And sometimes he has historical documents that show, they would even call the driver, if they were involved in a fatality, a murderer, for example. But there was a corresponding pushback from auto-related interests. They introduced this concept of jaywalking and crosswalks, and that pedestrians should only be in the road, in specific circumstances. And that they obviously eventually prevailed with that. That really changed the way we conceptualize who roads are for. And pretty quickly, that this whole huge area of cities and right-of-way was given over to cars almost entirely. And this is a little bit different road here on the right, but it's just about 20 years later, and you can see, almost all the pedestrians are cleared from not just the road, but the sidewalks, and it completely changed the way the space is used. Okay, so that's all I'm going to get into with the history for right now, but we have this trend in the US where we've seen traffic deaths rising. The US is sort of an outlier globally, especially for developed nations or wealthy nations. And it used to be we could kind of expect traffic deaths to decline. We were supposed to be getting better at this. We spend, you know, uh, tens of $billions a year on roadways, and where we always say the number one thing in transportation is to improve safety. But our outcomes have actually eroded pretty significantly in the past 10 years. So we're talking about if we were doing as well as we did 10 years ago in the US, we'd be saving about 10,000 lives a year. And if we look forward a decade, if we're not able to make up that lost ground, we're talking about 100,000 additional lives being lost. So this trend, this erosion in our traffic safety outcomes is driven in large part by vulnerable road users, and pedestrians is what I've focused on a lot in my book, because a lot more pedestrians get killed than cyclists. But we see a similar trend here with cyclists in the United States, and to some extent even motorcyclists as well. So between 2009 and 2022, we saw about an 80%, over an 80% increase. So, and just keep in mind, my book was published in 2020. So I'm finishing up writing it right around here. And then during the pandemic, we have an enormous increase. It's almost unprecedented. They rose about 20% almost overnight. And there is some data that shows there's actually a lot less walking taking place. Fewer people were even out making walking trips to transit, to work, whatever, walking the dog. So there's good evidence that roads got a lot more dangerous quickly during that period also. And that was, again, after the book was published. Okay, just to put things a little bit in more of an international context, here is the United States compared with a lot of other developed nations. You can see, again, we're kind of an outlier. A lot of other countries are having better success reducing road deaths. France and Japan are highlighted here. We look at even Canada and the United States as sort of aspirational, although Canada is a little bit of an outlier too. If you talk to traffic safety experts there and think that their record is very bad compared to some world leaders, like particularly in Western Europe and Scandinavia. So in the United States, one of the things, now I want to talk a little bit about who is getting killed. And in the United States, there's a little bit of a misconception, I think, especially among like media figures or important politicians, that the kind of person getting killed is like this person. When they think about a pedestrian death, he's like this wired millennial, and he's in a crosswalk in maybe a major city. And I think that this is just kind of, they have a little bit of a windshield bias. This might be sort of what they observe on their drive to work, and it annoys them. So they're kind of extrapolating from that. But the reality is the kind of people who are getting killed are much more like this guy over here who's, just kind of sprinting across this wide arterial road. And I'm sort of making some assumptions about this guy, but I think it's sort of safe that probably he's a lower income guy. Most people wouldn't choose to sort of not drive in an environment like this if they had a lot of better options. So, fun fact about this, just real quickly, since I started giving this presentation, this is a photo I took outside of Cleveland in a suburb. I presented for someone from someone that was from the suburb. They said they have since added a crosswalk here. So baby steps, making progress. So anyway, more about who is getting killed. So this is a problem that there's some patterns from who's getting killed that we can tease out, and that one of the groups we see some sort of racial demographic data come through. We know that Black people are disproportionately likely to be killed or injured this way in the U.S., and Native Americans are at extremely high risk. I'm going to talk more about that later in the presentation, but a lot of groups, pretty much any group that would be considered a little bit marginalized, or really the kind of people we haven't been designing our transportation systems with them front of mind, are at higher risk to be killed this way. Older adults are a group that's at heightened risk. And as far back as about a decade ago, the CDC predicted, just because of the growth in the population in the US and many countries is aging very quickly. They predicted that pedestrians would rise just because the population was aging. So we have more people that are more vulnerable, A, and B, we haven't been doing a very good job planning for these folks with their needs in mind. No, I think I'm using US data here, but I think this would be something you would see across the board. I would imagine lower income folks are at higher risk to be killed this way, people living in low income neighborhoods. So our data shows this really clearly. And I think the explanations for that are it's sort of self-explanatory. Lower income people might be walking or biking more for transportation out of necessity. And also, I'm going to talk more about this later in the presentation, but their neighborhoods may not be getting the same kind of attention and resources that wealthier neighborhoods are. So that sort of compounds the problem. There's also a geographic component to this. Now, this is I know we have an international audience here. I just want to touch on this real briefly. These are the most dangerous states in the U.S., and I think that you notice it's pretty obvious they're almost exclusively southern states. These are states that developed a little later in our nation's history. These are the states like Florida that developed a lot more. People didn't start moving there en masse until after the invention of air conditioning. So that was after 1940. If you remember those two photos I showed at the beginning that show the nice walkable street in Cleveland in the streetcar era, Florida wasn't very developed then, and neither was Texas. But since then, it was developing at the height of the highway era. So they have a lot of wide, pretty dangerous roads in a lot of these states. And incidentally, these are some of the fastest growing states in the US. So that contributes to the problem as well here, that the growth that we see. One thing I will say, again, because this is for an international audience, there really is a lot of variation within US states. And some of the safer US states, like Rhode Island have a similar traffic fatality or mortality rate as Germany. So we do see sort of wide variations in within the United States. Okay, so a little bit more about where people are being killed. This is a map I like to use, and it's what I want to focus on here is what's happening in the suburbs. We've had sort of a big demographic change in our suburban areas, and I think you'll have to think through your own individual local context how much this applies, but cities have become more expensive and suburbs have become more diverse. In a lot of US cities, I think that's happening to a certain degree in Canada and Europe. This map shows it's a map of racial segregation, and it shows the green shows where concentrations of Black people live, and the orange shows where white people are concentrated, and then the yellow shows people who are Latino or Hispanic, and then so anyway, this is in 1990, and at that time, I think that we still have this sort of old-fashioned idea of how cities are populated and what suburbs look like in the US. And it really does kind of correspond with this map back in 1990, where the northern suburbs of Atlanta at that time were majority white and the city was majority Black. But that's really shifted a lot. I don't have the most, they stopped making these maps. So I don't have the most recent data, but you can see uh, much more our suburbs, the northern suburbs of Atlanta, and this is a trend sort of across the United States, and I assume um, in a lot of other metro areas outside the US as well, much more diverse. In fact, there's this area kind of right here it is a big sort of landing spot for new immigrants that come from, there's a lot of immigration from countries that have much lower car ownership rates than the United States. So people are moving to this area, and they're out in these suburban areas that were never designed so with the thought that people would be walking or using public transit. And people are arriving there without a car and having to rely that now the most dangerous bus or the most dangerous road in the Atlanta metro area. It runs right through here. It's called Buford Highway. A lot of portions don't have sidewalks. It's very wide. It's a widely used transit route, again, used by a lot of new immigrants, very dangerous. And it was almost sort of designed like a rural road. But the context around it has really changed a lot. So the point I'm really trying to make with this slide is just that our suburbs have changed a lot. They're much more diverse. There's a higher population living in poverty in the suburbs. In fact, the average poor person in the US now lives in the suburbs rather than the city. But our suburbs really haven't changed very much. We still have this old kind of conception, and they're becoming very dangerous. What are the points I try to make in this presentation? So here again is this racial dot map. I'm using Cleveland, where I'm from. You can see it's a pretty segregated city here. Now, if we look at that, and we see this in many, many cities, I'm just using Cleveland here as an example. You see, these are our most dangerous roads, and you can see how they correspond almost exactly with neighborhoods of color, so Black, Latino neighborhoods in Cleveland. That's pretty common. We see that in city after city. This is another example I like to use. Portland. Portland, I think a lot of us, they're a leader in the US in designing safe infrastructure, right? They've invested a lot in safe streets, but we see the same pattern in Portland. And so they made this nice map here on the left, and it shows everyone who was killed in the city over 2 years, and they use their first names to kind of humanize the issue, which I think is really nice. But you can see they're not happening in a random pattern. There's this clear concentration here on the right side of the map. So this is another thing that's very common. And in Portland, they have this big socioeconomic dividing line right here, East 82nd Street, it's called. And everything east of 82nd Street is East Portland. So East Portland, for the purposes of this presentation, is poorer and more diverse than the rest of the city. And people who live there are much more likely to be killed in traffic. They're about twice as likely. So, about half of the traffic deaths that happen in Portland occur in East Portland, despite the fact that only about a quarter of the city lives there. And you can see that gets into there's this infrastructure disparity, right? Which neighborhoods are getting these nice bike lane treatments, and which neighborhoods are really at higher risk. There seems to be a mismatch here. So they mapped here again the 30 highest crash intersections in Portland. 28 of 30 are in East Portland. So not only is it important to get for us to be upgrading our infrastructure, but it's also important that we think about how equal the way it's dispersed is. It's important for our safety outcomes. So I like to use this sort of as an example of kind of neglect, right, of certain communities and how that sort of plays out. And this is borrowed from some really good research that that was done at the University of Minnesota, and they were looking at traffic safety on tribal lands and reservations. And this is a photo that was shot there. I already mentioned that Native folks have really increased risk to be hit and killed. And they went out to a lot of these places and they interviewed folks that live there or visit a lot. And they said, what's your top concern with regards to traffic safety? And people were saying, pedestrian safety all the time. But these are the kind of sort of treatments here. And this picture shows on one side there's a tribal service center, and on the other there's a food cellar. So you can see there's heavy traffic, but no accommodations, no sidewalk, no crossing, no traffic light. It's just a regular rural road. So in this study, they interviewed, again, the people that live there, but also the state DOT folks, the people who had the authority to sort of provide these kind of treatments. And they found that there was this big disconnect. So they were sort of just diverting to the DOT when they weren't mentioning pedestrian safety A. And even when they were pressed on it, they would say, well, it's drunk walking or something like that points the finger back at folks who live there and the victims. So there is a little bit of I think on the part of institutional leaders, not enough respect sort of for local voices, and not enough responsiveness in a lot of cases. So this is a meme. I don't know if a lot of you have seen it, but we see these kind of environments, and that was a more rural example, but we see this is ubiquitous in the United States, right? Maybe a lot of you are from countries where you're lucky enough where a lot of your built environment isn't like this. But this is suburban arterial, the most dangerous kind of street for pedestrians, and particularly when there's low income housing and retail along the street. A lot of destinations people would want to access, but how pedestrians access them has really been an afterthought in the US. Okay, so I'm going to try to speed up sort of the pace I'm going, but just to reiterate a little bit. We have a population that's getting a little older in the US. They're also living in more dangerous places because we have more lower income folks living in the suburbs. The population is aging a little bit. And then we have this other trend. There's a number of trends going on that contribute to this problem. And that is that our vehicle mix has shifted a lot in the United States. So if we go back to 2010, the majority of cars were being sold were sedans. And pretty quickly, that kind of shifted. And now the majority of cars are SUVs and pickups. And it's really not even close anymore. A lot of sedans have sort of only about 2 or 3 of our top 10 best-selling vehicles in the U.S. anymore are sedans, and a lot of U.S. automakers kind of stopped making them.
And by the way, people that are from outside of the US, this is what Angie is calling trucks. Light trucks in the US is not big trucks for transportation, but actually cars that people are switching instead of having a small Honda Civic, they are buying these kind of trucks. And by the way, the space for cargo, on average, people use it one day a year. Okay, Angie, go ahead. Now we see you and we hear you.
Okay, so I was just talking about. So, did you guys hear this part? You're more likely to be hit and killed if you're hit by a bigger car. And the U.S. auto market has shifted a lot from this car on the left to more like this car on the right, which makes it much harder for pedestrians to survive these crashes. Here's an example. This is the number one selling vehicle in the U.S., the RAV4, outside of pickups. You can see it got like 1,000 pounds heavier, and it now has this big scowling, menacing grill. Sort of has to do with the way our society is unraveling. I think it's sort of a symptom of some of our social dysfunction. But anyway, this really does. I mean, they look mean, and it really does hurt people. It really is more dangerous. So we have a lot of data that shows that, including, our federal government did a study where they reviewed 15 studies and found, SUVs were a lot more killing people. And even the shape of the fan contributes a lot. So I'm not going to, I always use this. My son, he was 4. There's also a lot of visibility issues presented by vehicles like this is a lifted F-250. So it's a little bit of an extreme case, but not unusual at all to see a car like this around the US, even in a city. And you can see he was 4 there. He'd be, totally invisible. And they're getting to the point where even a short woman is nearly invisible standing in front of some of these trucks. This extends to a lot of our best-selling vehicles in the U.S., unfortunately. They have big blind zones, and there's a group called kidsincars.org that did a study where they experiment to see how many kids would fit in the blind zone of some of the best-selling vehicles, and they kind of like ran out of children whose parents would allow them to do this. So big blind zones that present risk as well, especially in an urban environment. This might be fine sort of on a highway. That might be its intended use. But, sort of at a crosswalk, the visibility is really bad. Okay, so that's kind of my explanation of what's going on in the U.S. I'm going to talk transition now to talking a little bit about solutions. I think we lost a little bit of time, so I'll kind of try to breeze through it. But this is a woman that I write about in my book who's really inspiring, Amy Cohen. And she lost her son. She's holding this photo, Sammy. He was 12 years old. He was walking to soccer practice in New York City. And she has started organizing other sort of victims, people who have been seriously injured, or many of them they lost a child or spouse. And some of them here are shown in this picture. And she's been advocating for some changes. I know you guys have a chapter in Toronto as well that's been doing some really good work. Families for Safe Streets, they call themselves. And I just want to highlight this because there really is a need for more of this kind of advocacy. And it's been sort of lacking. It hasn't been recognized as sort of an issue, a social issue deserving of attention, sort of until very recently. And that's one of the things, I was trying to address in writing this book. And one of the things, continuing to work on it, we really struggle sort of to get across. Now, again, moving on to talking about solutions. One thing I want to point out is just that it's very context specific. So the solutions really will be different if we think about like reservation land in Minnesota might be different from what's proposed sort of in central Toronto. But one tool I really like to address this is something called a pedestrian safety audit or a walk audit. And here's an example of one we did sort of in Cleveland, where you just invite people, and you can invite local leaders and police officers, medics, whoever is an important stakeholder in your community, and just walk sort of your streets. And in my work, I've found that people living in communities really understand sort of what the danger points are and sort of what the best solutions might be. That often they just haven't really been listened to, and the government just isn't being responsive to these kind of concerns. So here's an example of sort of a tactical urbanism demonstration we did in Cleveland in response to something like this. There again is a photo of my son, just showing how you can test out sort of different treatments that shorten sort of crossing distances and, help give pedestrians a little more power in their sort of interactions on the street. One point I wanted to make in the presentation too, and I always say this is, I think a lot of people, they hear a presentation like this and they think, well, what's the sort of silver bullet solution, right? And they want it to be a design solution. I really like pedestrian refuge islands as a solution. It's really not a very sexy sort of treatment. It's sort of, we've had these forever. They're not very expensive. So the problem isn't really sort of a lack of tools. We just haven't had the will to implement them, really, I think. Um, there's also, probably a lot of you are familiar with this. We can be overhauling our streets a little bit. And a lot of times we know now, Vision Zero, I know there's some Vision Zero folks on the call. More and more cities are thinking about traffic deaths that way. Usually there's it's an overwhelming problem, but usually there's 2 or 3 corridors or a handful of corridors in every city that account for a wildly disproportionate share of injuries and deaths, right? And this example is from Columbus, Ohio. This is Sullivan Avenue, which is a low income street that has a lot of crime issues, a lot of social issues. It also has a bus route. And as part of Vision Zero Columbus, they overhauled this street a little bit. And you can see that actually this isn't that dramatic of a change. They added these little median buffers, island things, and they did these bump outs. And one thing that I think that's nice about that is they thought about, this is a transit route, and they thought carefully about how transit riders were going to access those stops, and they designed the road with that in mind. So very effective. These kind of overhauls are very effective in many cities. They go a lot farther, and there may be opportunities in your city to go farther with this kind of thing if it's a very wide street, adding bus infrastructure, adding protected bike lanes. But yeah, I was told in Columbus, this design almost overnight stopped, egregious speeding. That was the big safety concern here. Another thing I wanted to discuss just real briefly, I'm running out of time. I'm sorry, I'll speed this up. Is lighting, because lighting is really important. 75% of pedestrian deaths happen at night in the US anyway. So this shows 2 cities. This is where I live, Cleveland down here, and this is Detroit up here. And this was taken from space, but it's a little bit of a success story. Detroit, who came up earlier, is a pretty dangerous city for pedestrians. And they were emerging from bankruptcy around this period. And they realized that 40% of their street lights weren't functioning. There was something, they had burned out. They weren't being taken care of and maintained. So they did this big bond issue, and you can see that before they had done this, they were having about 25 pedestrian deaths a year in dark, unlighted conditions. As soon as they start upgrading their traffic light or street lights and making them LED, which saves energy and is sort of a win-win-win-win that helps with crime concerns, you can see that their traffic deaths start declining pretty dramatically. And they go from having 25 deaths in dark, unlighted conditions a year to 1, almost overnight. And that's in the context of pedestrian deaths rising throughout the rest of the state and the rest of the country. So that's okay. So this is my final slide, and I know we want to get in some questions, but one thing that's a big inspiration to us in the US is we do have a few cities that are sort of achieving Vision Zero finally, or getting close to it. And I know we have an international crowd here. Oslo is a big inspiration to us also, but this is taken from, and again, these treatments and solutions need to be very context specific, but one of our big inspirations is Hoboken, New Jersey, which is right outside New York City, where they haven't had any traffic deaths for about 5 years. And this is a tool they use called intersection daylighting, or basically they just don't allow cars to park near these, near the crosswalk, near the intersection, where they would produce a big blind zone for people crossing. And that would especially be true with some of these larger mega trucks, right? Where the blind zone might be even bigger. So in Hoboken, they've just changed the way they operate, and they make this standard. Not only did they paint these and use these low cost treatments, but now every time they're out and they're rehabbing a street, they're making this permanent, and they're using concrete, and they're making daylighting, just sort of the rules, and changing the way their roads work. And that's been very effective in this context. So with that, I'm sorry about those technical problems we have. I do want to get back with Gil and check in if there's any questions. And I hope that was helpful to you guys.
Running out of time, but we want to ask you for one last comment. What would be your call to action? Here we have people from all over the world, Pakistan, Chile, Denmark, across the US and Canada. How can we contribute? How can all of us contribute to have safe streets? What do you think that citizens, we say this is not a time for citizens to be spectators. And one of the things I ask people is to please fill out the survey that goes right after, giving out ideas on how to make. But in your case, what is your call to action to all of us so that we can put our grain of sand and contribute positively in some way to have safer streets?
Yeah, I would say start locally. Start with a problem that drives you crazy. You know, when you're walking your kid to school, get involved. That's a way you can get engaged if you're not already with local government. And along the way, make friends, you know, be nice. We need to sort of repair sort of our social ties too at the same time. We have a lot of fragmentation in the US, but it's a good way you can get involved and get empowered with local government and be a voice for, you know, something positive. And we need more folks kind of fighting the good fight there at that local level. Like I said, I do think it makes a difference, you know, those little actions, and everyone can get involved. I think your suggestion about honoring World Day of Remembrance is a really good one. And if you go to their website, I don't know if someone could throw it in the chat, you can find out if there's a local event near you, tweeting about it. If you see a news report that blames the victims, maybe a nice outreach to that journalist saying, hey, that's really not the best way to frame it. This is really a systemic problem, and we all have a role to play here in making sure everyone's protected and safe.
Thank you very much. I also think the people that have families for Safe Street is such an amazing group of people everywhere in Toronto and in New York and in many other cities. They have already lost a member of their family, their children, their parents, their moms. And on top of it, they are volunteering their leisure, their free time, their leisure to go and help so that it will not happen to other families. So let's be nice to them. And if you have any possibility to donate or volunteer or collaborate in any way, please do it. Angie, thank you very much. What a great presentation. You gave so many examples, not only on why streets are not safe, but how to make them safe. Specific examples that can be applied immediately in cities all over the world. There are no accidents. There are incidents that can be avoided. And you have shown many of the ways that we can make streets safe for people of all ages and abilities everywhere. Thank you very much.